Be careful. If you're married and have a living trust with your spouse that's more than 5 years old, it is likely you have an AB trust. In some situations, an AB trust is a good choice, but this little video is going to focus on some of the hidden traps found in this type of plan. Let me give you a quick overview first of what an AB trust plan looks like. This type of trust starts out like most family trusts. The settlers, trustees, a married couple, are generally free to add and subtract assets to this type of trust. Upon the death of the first spouse to die, an AB trust plan usually mandates that all of the trust assets of the family trust be split equally between a survivor's side of an imaginary wall and a decedent's side of that imaginary wall. Let's say that a husband and wife have trust assets worth $1.5 million. When one spouse dies, half of the trust assets, in my example, $750,000, are allocated to the survivor's side of the wall. It's called the survivor's trust, or a trust. The decedent's $750,000 worth of assets are allocated to the decedent's side of the wall, called the bypass, or credit trust. Thus the B trust in an AB trust plan. I'm keeping this simple, trying to only show you the big picture of an AB plan. Each of the two trusts, the bypass trust and the survivor's trust, have rules that must be followed by the surviving spouse. Generally, the surviving spouse can be in charge of both sides of the split. He or she can usually do whatever they want with the assets of the survivor's trust. The big change is that the surviving spouse generally has rules that must be followed with respect to the bypass trust. The typical rules are that the surviving spouse receives and can use all of the income generated by the bypass trust, but can only use principal for his or her health care, education, support, and maintenance. On top of that, the surviving spouse must keep records of how the money was spent. That comes as a surprise to many couples. Most couples think that they can do just whatever they want when the first spouse passes away. Here's another surprise. The surviving spouse must have his or her CPA, or someone with experience, prepare an additional federal and state income tax form reporting the income generated by the bypass trust, which was paid out to the surviving spouse. And if the bypass trust doesn't pay out all of its income, the bypass trust will be taxed at a high tax rate on that retained income. You see, another surprise for families. Finally, the biggest surprise of all. After the death of the surviving spouse, when the beneficiaries receive assets from that bypass trust, there will be a capital gains tax on all capital assets that have appreciated in value after the first spouse's death. Using the example I gave you before, we'll say the assets in the survivor's trust appreciated in value from $750,000 to $1 million, and the assets in the bypass trust appreciated in value from $750,000 to $1 million. Now, if the beneficiaries sell everything from the survivor's trust right away, it is unlikely that there will be any capital gains tax from the sale of those assets. Why? Because the survivor's trust belonged to the surviving spouse. If those assets were sold quickly after the death of the survivor, it is unlikely that there was any appreciation in the value of those assets. Therefore, no capital gains tax. But the assets in the bypass trust belong to the first spouse. Those assets have appreciated in value since the first spouse's death. That appreciation on the assets of the bypass trust is a taxable gain. If those assets were capital assets like property and stock, the sale of those assets will generate a capital gains tax upon their sale because of the $250,000 appreciation on those assets. And don't forget that the combined state and federal capital gains tax rates can exceed 25% on that appreciation. Thus, in my simple example, there can be a $50,000 or higher capital gains tax due when the beneficiaries sell the bypass trust assets. That's quite a surprise, isn't it? Okay, I've given you very simplistic examples of some of the hidden surprises and traps when you're dealing with an AB trust plan. I didn't account for deductions, write-offs, tax brackets, or other economic conditions that can affect how much capital gains tax you pay. The point of my little video is that different types of trust plan choices should be explained to you before you select any type of living trust plan. Don't just pick the trust plan your friend has or that you heard about on TV. There may be better economic choices for your particular situation. That's lots to think about. But I hope you learned something from my little video. Please feel free to share it with friends and family. And don't forget to check out my website. I'm estate planning attorney, Hollis Logue.